Hello and welcome to Bump to Business Owner. I'm your host, Caroline Marshall, and welcome to our little mini-series about redundancy. So the reason we're doing this is that basically I went on a lovely podcast called Mambition. Check them out. We'll put a link in the comments. What other female podcasts, especially ones about mumming and careering. And when I met Tiff and Alex, the lovely hosts of the podcast, we just had a little chat, got to know each other. And I think from there they start to pull out what themes they might want to make a podcast on. And Tiff came back to me and was like, I really want to focus on your redundancy story and being that it was in a glass office window. And I was like, yeah, sure, like, cool, that's your angle, yeah. We should talk about it. And I remember actually going into recording this episode, had a flashback way back when we started the podcast. I think I recorded an episode on that job. Maybe it was on the redundancy. And so this would have been almost 3 years ago. And I think it's very new to podcasting as well. But also I was still so recovering from everything that had happened. I think the recording came from a place where I think I clearly needed to process it and still rant, because then Mary, bless her, edited the podcast and I listened to it and I was like, oh my God, we can't release that. And so somewhere hidden in our files is an episode where there's a less healed, recovered version of me, still very angry about it. And I think this is why this is a good time to do it, because I think while I don't like the real, I was saying it from a place of like, I can't believe this happened to me and I can't believe this would happen to anyone. And I think this is the thing, and it's gone, and it's the first thing I've ever had on social media go viral. And you know, nothing happens when you go viral, by the way, nothing life-changing. Instagram's probably treating me a bit better, giving me a bit more visibility. That's about it. But it actually felt really good as well, because you know, you get all the comments and you know, like, well, there wasn't anything horrendously bad, or maybe that's just me being a bit desensitized to social media now. You know, I got to laugh at some of them, but you know, some of them though really did resonate, and that I'm not alone in this story. And I think there's so many small businesses, startups and scale ups, so many people in this world who run businesses who just have no idea that if redundancy happens, we've got it. We've been through it 3 times as a household in 2 years here. We both work in the startup world, but my husband's were treated fairly and with kindness. And because I also know, because I actually heard one of them, because it was during COVID and I was in the next room, so I could actually hear his redundancy being made, which was awkward, but fairly and with kindness. And I think that is what's the key here. And so many women and mothers aren't treated fairly and with kindness, and I think we all relate to this in so many systems we're in, with big review now into maternity care and the systems we're within. And I think this filters through, and this is what, you know, why I'm doing a mini series, because I do think while the circumstances I were in were awful, I think I handled it the best I could. I had a really good support network, which we'll talk about in the next ones, and just talk about how I handled it in the short term and in the long term, because you know, knowledge is power. And sharing stories is also power. And thankfully, I am not under NDA. Someone did say in the comments, name and shame, and I was like, no, I'm not going that far, but anyone can do their research, can't they? So where did it begin? So I was working in a startup. I gave so much to, and I wasn't the only one. Started by 2 young, very naive, the likes of the tech bro standard, as you'd expect, sort of people. Started a business, had some angel investment / family money, paid them to start a business, and they employed really well. I'll give them this. They employed really well. So me and a couple of colleagues basically built several areas of the business. I built up the client side. That was the area I found a talent in, and it really got nurtured there. And I made some wonderful colleagues there, by the way, some of whom I'm friends with, keep in touch with, and work on the outsource team with, which is lovely. And I worked when I say I worked really hard, like I would be doing all the billable work during the day and then building in the evening. And I got pregnant in 2017, just after my second promotion there to be head of client onboarding, whatever that was. But basically they had no one to actually make sure the clients were onboarded well, make sure, you know, if a client is going to be with an agency, you can tell in the first 3 months if it's going to be a success. And that's where all the clients were falling over at that time. And I knew exactly how to make a client a success and what processes we needed to do that. I got pregnant, and that's where it all fell down, because I couldn't overwork. I couldn't work like I was. I had, like I've told many times, I really suffered prenatally, mental health wise, and a doctor forced me to, and it was only in desperation I ended up going to this doctor, because I was crying every day And even when I had a break and went to Cornwall, I was still crying every day there, and it was awful. And I just turned 30 and I just felt in my lowest place and was really hard on myself. And I went to the doctor and was like, and they were like, she was amazing. God's angel in heaven. She was like, I get why you're like this. I get it. You're worried about your career. I get it. She's like, but if you do not agree to being written off for 50% of your time for at least 2 weeks, we're going to have another discussion here, because you have to do this. And obviously, doctor's orders, the company had to do it. And that was a lot of things. I think I didn't trust them ultimately. It got to this point. There was signs all along, like they wanted to give over my role completely, and then they wanted someone on client retention. And I was like, well, I can do that. I've done this. I know. And I had been doing it anyway. When I said head of client onboarding, I was like troubleshooting all the client problems, which is quite heavy work. But, I do it now for my own business, but there's a lot less problems here. I also financially wasn't ready. They had no maternity leave policy, and they brought in statutory maternity pay. And I was like, well, I'm going to take 8 weeks. We're going to do this together with my husband. I really saw it as a team effort. If you've listened to Rachel Child's podcast episode, I thought I was actually doing everything right to try and put in place equality. It just didn't work out quite that way. It was a whole process, but I think we do quite well. Don't tell my husband that. I do quite well with equity. I went back 8 weeks postpartum, and they gave me a new job role, which I wanted, the job spec, but then they wanted me to do 50% of billable time, having experienced what it was like to work there. I'm not going to do this job justice. You're setting me up for failure. Managed to reduce that and still came back, and it was awful. I was given a really challenging client who didn't know what they wanted, and I normally am, and I being the person who was normally in charge of that, I immediately felt like a failure, that I couldn't figure out this client, work it out. And also just things, I was also in charge of so much of working with this other team. They were called, I can't remember what they were called, but their job was to look after the VAs, but also kind of look after clients. And so I had a lot of work to do with them, and there was a lot of unhappiness in this role. It was a really hard role. I'd done that role as well previously, and it's a horrible role that they gave them. They were also set up for failure, and we had all these people set up for failure. I was also postpartum. I basically came out the whole thing looking awful, so bad. They gave me a 360 review when I was 4 months postpartum, and I still can't believe this. And can I say, the sick person that I am, I still have this feedback because it's going in my book one day, to show how far you can come. And I'm still traumatized by it. I send the Upsource team, everyone on the team, a feedback form every year, and it includes all areas of the business, working with the community managers, whatever, and it's anonymous, and I die every year I send it, and it's always good. And I think it's because of this 360 review, it was traumatizing. Some of the things, and actually when my friend, she also got made redundant like a year later after me, but she said as part of her exit, she was like, should never have happened to Caroline. And I was like, thank you, babe. I love it was your exit, but you had my back still, even though I'd gone. I was like, thank you. That's really nice to hear. Because she also read it. She had access to it, which was also really bad that people had access to my 360 review who shouldn't have done. She wasn't my manager or anything. She was a colleague. Anyway, and good on her for reading it. Thank you. It validated me. So I'm not blaming her. I'm blaming the system, the company. Somehow they gave me a coach who was also a male with no children, unmarried, not my stage of life, and just represented who the founders were. So I'd already at this point by the January been like, oh, there's like maternity coaches. And he was like, yeah, like this is good to know. So I was like, great. Okay. So definitely not getting a, coach who might actually know what I'm going through and be able to communicate that to you properly and put these processes in place. Somehow, despite this 360, which I also got a week before my wedding, I managed to climb out. of this. I don't like to be defeated. Can you tell by this now? I'm like, right, I'm going to do everything I can to seem more approachable, to seem more personable, and I'd got to the 4 months regression at this point. So I still had a lot of tears going on because I was not sleeping at this point. And this team unhappiness was actually rising. And I was kind of more removed from it, so I couldn't be blamed. So I was like, just kind of being toxic happy at this point. I remember at one point I was chatting to my coach. I was like, yeah, I'm happy. And he's like, you seem like the only person who is. And I was like, I think I was just being like, I can't be anything else but happy here. So they can all deal with the other people who are unhappy. And at this point, there were things coming. And actually, I also know my contract did get changed at some point. Don't know what happened there, but never mind. Somehow my contract didn't get changed. Tried to get me to sign a new one. Something like that happened. So you can see all these little red flags are coming up to my redundancy. They also brought in a new head of people, I think. And again, I went in super optimistically. It was always going to happen. A business was growing and everyone was unhappy. You need a head of people to make people happy. So I was on board with this, and it wasn't really directly with my role as a customer person. I wasn't reporting into or anything. It's really hard to, be down on individuals because, again, she was stuck in that system. But she definitely came in either being told she was going to make me redundant or don't. So I think she found a way to dislike me from the start to make it easier for herself. Because even though, I think she definitely stereotyped me as a certain person and we were very different. Whereas I know if we went back 2 generations to my grandparents' generation, we were actually from the same part of the country, and we'd probably have a lot more in common if she'd actually chatted to me. But there was a lot of things that came in, including calling me Lady Muck when I said I don't drive, I get driven. And that is only because of my driving anxiety, not because I think I'm above driving. Trust me, I know my life would be a lot easier if I drove. But yeah, so things like that. So at this point, you're probably going to ask, Caroline, why the hell did you stay? They didn't want you, you don't want them. So why did I stay? And we all know this, and the answer is, well, actually I have 2 answers. Motherhood. It was like, better the devil you know. Who is going to hire me? And no, they know in this job, they promoted me twice within 18 months. They know I'm shit hot at what I do. I get stuff done and I will overwork if needed. And if a client, which they did, if client messaged in the evenings unhappy, I responded. I was there. I was that person. I would do that. I was, ride or die. They made me believe I was an owner. You're not an owner of a company until you have equity. So that's why. Also, number 2, twofold, I was also, where would I have gone to? And I can say this as a PA, there's a massive ceiling on the PA role, and that's because of its background and where it comes from. But I had wanted to get out of it. But I didn't have enough experience to be really seen for customer experience roles at other startups and things. I knew that. I knew what I could bring operational and customer wise, but they wouldn't see me. I just knew they wouldn't. These companies, they see PA on it and they're like, okay, you can be a PA, and that was it. And I'm like, and I don't think there's many roles there. It's really hard unless you go fractional freelance contract. I also think it's hard to get great PA roles that work in motherhood, and I think that's becoming a thing again. So there was a lack of opportunities for mothers and PAs, and I was like, wow, I'm going to have another baby, I'll stay here. And it got worse. It had got worse. I think despite my toxic positivity, relations got worse with everyone is really unhappy in a company. And there was this team I had to work with. I remember one time I was trying to teach them how we were doing this processing in customer success, and they got also really stupid things, like they had no dog policy. And I know I love dogs, don't get me wrong, well, I'm a cat person, but me and my friend on my team are still traumatized by this because she wasn't even in the meeting, she was only on it virtually, she didn't join it in person. But these 2 dogs started running riot and everyone just ignored it, it was okay for me just to be interrupted in this meeting. They did things like they wanted to review the entire onboarding process. And I was like, you have just done this a year ago. And I got glowing feedback, so glowing, by one of the, he was an investor or advisor in the business who'd gone through this process. And he said, it's been so good. I've told the founders they need to up their game compared to what you guys are doing. So thanks. It was so good, and it was only a year later, and it wasn't like things were going wrong. And luckily my friend had my back because it was one of the founders who did sales. She was like, well, if we're doing that, it starts with sales. It all starts from the sales point. So we were reviewing what he does as well, and then somehow that never happened. So thank you, lovely, for having my back there. You see what I mean? There's so much positive from this story. There's so many amazing people that had my back in the scenes. So that's where I've needed the healing and recovery piece to be able to talk about it, to also find this zone of my life, very validating stuff, but to see how a culture and top down can just make you all so bad, but you still fight for each other behind the scenes. Isn't that lovely? So yeah, and because everyone was so unhappy, and we had this head of people, they were like, right, we're going to review everything. Or they were reviewing the role. They came from a different angle, reviewing my role because it wasn't working. And they brought in one of the team who was leaving. and who I know never particularly liked how quickly I got promoted, let's say. There were bad things. I was very up for maybe my role going, and I think a few people were, because it left space for them to be in that role, which fair play. But they put me in a room with my colleague and kept directing questions to her. It was so awkward. Directing questions to her that were bits of my job, saying who should do this, but setting her up to say, well, actually, I should do this. And it was just so awkward. And I walked out that meeting with my colleague going, I'm being made redundant. And she's like, don't be ridiculous. Like, no. And then I got on a call with all this team who were all unhappy in their roles, and none of them were listening to me. I could tell. And the atmosphere was just rude. And it was like, one of them knew one of them knew I was being made redundant and had told them all, because the attitude I was getting, it's like, you're going to be gone soon, so we're not listening. It was literally that. And we had a client that was really challenging, and it was a team of people on there, and at one point they were like, let's get on a call, and I was like, I need to go pick up my child from nursery. And I got a look, like a smug look. I was like, I'm gonna have to get on this call and just be late. So I made that choice in that moment, got on the call, and basically got completely everything I'd been told, this is what we have to do, had been backtracked on that call and made it look like, again, that I'd done this. And it was weird. I'd started as well. I remember they started being like, oh, you need to build case studies. They were obsessed. It was basically getting me to put down my knowledge. So I was building case studies, and the new head of people was like, oh, check them with me. That's fine. I don't mind. And I'm like, great, thanks. That's really helpful. So then I'd done it. I said, look, here's the work I've started. Is this the right path? And she was like, who would you normally run this past? I was like, oh, I don't know, like maybe this coach I've been working with. And she just kind of stared at me, and I went and cried in the toilets. It was basically saying, this isn't good enough. And I don't even know if that's true. I think it probably might have been. But it was just like these things that kept coming in. And I did take a personal day, because I was like, I can't cope with this anymore. I can't deal with this. And then I had a call with my boss. I think he hoped I was going to... all of this, I know they wanted me to quit, and I'm so doggedly persistent, as a lovely upsource client once said about me. And we'll go back to, I was in such a vulnerable stage of my life, and I needed money. Like, I had to pay for the mortgage and childcare. It's, it wasn't a question. We'd set it up for equality. So I clung on, and then 2 days later, going to the redundancy story, went in, and it was a team day. And they had role review for me at the end of the day. I don't know what had shifted in those 2 days, but I was like, I've got no work to do. I mean, that had never happened in the whole history of that company. I was always overworked. And I was like, I'm not feeling like, I think I did have work, but I was like, I don't need to do this. Like, it was really like, I'm not stressed. I'm not running off like burnt out energy. What's going on? I've got no work. And I went on a lunch break and called both my husband and my mum and been like, I'm being made redundant. And like, no, like, and I think my mum's like, you don't really? I was like, I think I am. I remember going to, like, we used to do like ficas, like team hangouts, and went to that. And it just, the atmosphere seemed weird. And then I went into my meeting, and yeah, that was it. So it was a co-working space, like anyone could book on to go to. There were companies that had offices there, and that we used to work in the open space, and just where you can grab any desk you can, and we'd grab the long desk right by these glassed offices. So all the team who'd come in for the team day, about 10 to 20 people, were out there, glass office, and I was sat outwards, and they didn't close the curtains, and they made me redundant. And I was like, just sat there, and I will go into what I did next, but it was also done incorrectly, because they offered me they have to offer you if there's roles open. They offered me the VA role, and I was like, well, that wasn't the only role that was open, so this isn't a serious redundancy, because you should offer me the next senior role, which I can do and have done. They should have offered me that, and they didn't. And yeah, they did it in front of a glass door. It's still crazy to think about. And then I had to walk out, and I didn't say anything, because these redundant, if you've never had the joy of being in a redundancy meeting, they're quite formal. There's a script, and the next steps is you, and we'll talk about that as well, because they're meant to give you time to pitch why your role is needed. depending on the redundancy. Of course, I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm talking about, I think this is mass redundancies is different to individual redundancies, which mine was an individual one. And they have to give you time to pitch to put together a proposal of why your role shouldn't be made redundant. And they didn't give me enough time to do that. So they didn't want me to do that. I took the hint. If you're being made redundant, don't do that. They don't want you. And it shouldn't be about you, it should be about the role, but here we are. And they did that, and yeah, I just had to walk out. And I remember walking out, I walked downstairs and I called my husband, and he was like, what? Like, he was away, my father-in-law needed him and he was ill. And so I had to do the whole nursery pickup after this as well. I called him. I wasn't allowed to tell anyone. And it's all very confusing when you're made redundant. I called him and I was like, should I go back and be like, why? Because I was just in shock, state of flight. I'd clearly gone into like flight and then was like, should I go back and fight for my God? I was like, should I go into fight mode and ask for feedback, so how I could have avoided this? And my husband thankfully talked sense to me and was like, no, you need to go home, Caroline. Like, you got to pick up Rafe anyway soon. Like, just go. And so I went home and wasn't allowed to tell anyone. So naturally I called my colleague or messaged her, and we had a big phone call. And I had 2 direct reports, and especially one of them, me and her had been working so closely together for a year, and I was like, yeah, she's going to do well tomorrow if I'm just not on Slack. So I called her too. And so I had 2 really long calls with before, which was good. I had time before going up pick up my son, and with them, and and both of them, it was like, what does this mean for us? Like, they was just so shocked. And I then picked up my son, wiped my tears away, picked up my son, managed through till bedtime, and ordered myself a McDonald's and a Prosecco, because that is the way you should handle it immediately. And the next episode we'll talk about the practicalities, because there's so much there to unpack about how you handle that in the short term, and also some of the things they also did wrong as part of the process. More tips on that. There's a lot of stuff they'd already done wrong, as you noticed, but there was more things in the process. And again, I don't share this with venom, with hardship. I just know it wasn't treated fairly and right. And I know now that it was a system that had been built there, and there will still be systems out there like it. And there are many women and mothers who might need this in their time of need. And because you go down a self-blame spiral, and we'll talk about, starting to learn, some of it, had I acted my best self that past year? I mean, no, as a postpartum mother, probably not, very much not. But I also know I could not take all the blame from what happened there. So yes, that is my story. So if you relate to this, and again, I also really don't like to come, I'm not into this, I'm not after coming individuals or individual companies, but it just hope that it can make people think the responsibility of starting a business and taking on employees is huge. Redundancies will happen, and I get that as a business owner. Cash flow is hard. It really is. It's a hard place to be, and you've got to make tough choices for the business, but you can always do things kindly and fairly. And this is, I think, the thing that I'll always stand on my mountain about.